Vertin, Vertin, Vertin. Oh, how I'm sure many of you who finished chapter 0 to 4 right now might know what I'm going to talk about today, since we'll be covering some spoilers from those chapters, but fear not. Even if you haven't finished all the chapters and don't mind some spoilers, you can sit back with everyone else and drink up all the tea that I'll pour into your cup today, because we have a lot to cover. So, let's start by outlining some key points. Things that you learned from the game. First, we know that the Foundation's goal is to defend the peace of mankind. They select and train Arcanist children from around the world at a school called SPDM, or School of Primary Defense of Mankind. Now, humor me for a second. Imagine you're 12 years old and living in a boarding school. There, they tell you that you're the chosen one, that it's your mission to become the backbone of the primary defense of mankind, that you're born to die a martyr, that to live is to lose things around you until the day you lose life itself to death. All the adults are telling you so. You probably can't resist the temptation of their words. It just sounds so sweet, so decadent, and so darn heroic. How can you ever resist this as a kid, right? But that's the reality of Arcanist children. To them, their entire role as Arcanists is to become the main defenders of mankind, because they're the chosen ones, and that's all they ever knew. Nothing else matters to them. Now, knowing this helps us understand Vertin a little bit more, because she was one of those children. She grew up in that environment for most of her childhood, much longer than any other children there. And just like them, she joined the Foundation. But, with a striking difference. Because she becomes the only timekeeper whose main responsibility is to record the beginnings and ends of eras of the outside world. And later on, she becomes in charge of all the investigations on the storm and Manus Vindictae. And we can't forget the fact that she's the only person from the Foundation who's allowed to move freely during the storm, and can count down how many hours are left before the storm hits. Clearly a special existence in the Foundation, right? And with that, those who have yet to catch up have a basic understanding of Vertin's background, so let's now focus on the more interesting tidbits and then tie them all together at the end to understand Vertin's true role in the story. First, we have Vertin's suitcase that she keeps by her side. It can shelter Arcanists during the storm, including our amazing radio pirate, Regulus. But more than that, we get a hint of its potential true purpose when Vertin specifically calls it a safe place, an ark sailing in the storm. Emphasis on the word ark here. When you think of the word ark, you can't help but think about the infamous Noah's Ark story from the Bible. The ark in that story had rooms inside, 3 decks, and a door. Well, I can't say for certain that we know how many rooms and decks are inside the suitcase. We do know that the suitcase has a good amount of rooms inside and a so-called outside space inside of it. So, with these connections, there's a strong chance that Vertin's suitcase references the Ark in the Noah's Ark story. But how does this help us understand Vertin's role? Well, let's answer that a little bit later and talk about the storm next, because it's closely tied with her suitcase's ability. Then the flood began. The fountains of the deep broke open, and the windows of heaven were opened. Rain poured for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose until every high hill on the earth was covered. Everything that lived on land perished in the raging flood waters. Genesis 7:17-24. These verses from the Bible describe the Genesis flood that happened in the Noah's Ark story. Remember to keep this description in mind because it'll be important later on. Now, as we might recall from the game, the storm essentially removes the existence of anyone who's not in the Foundation's building, the Manus Vindictae's building, and, Vertin's suitcase. At least for those who aren't Vertin. So if we view this removing process as perishing and not existing again in the current time period after the storm hits, then it could be that the storm is equivalent to that of the Genesis flood. And then it makes you wonder, is the storm made by a higher being? Or someone who believes themselves to be a higher being? And was it done to purify the world just like the Genesis flood? Let's see if we can answer those questions first. In chapter 1, we learned that the outside scenery in the suitcase has a lake with an old spinning wheel in the middle. Half of that wheel is submerged in the water, and strange threads that look two-dimensional are on it. The lake is also surrounded by a mysterious fog, and when Vertin approaches it, the water rises. Hold on a second. The water rises? Well, if that isn't an immediate connection to the Genesis flood, especially the verse about how the waters rose during it, then I don't know what is. But moving on, we learn that the ground is covered with rainwater from the storm. This water has no weight or humidity, it just flows slowly and quietly like time. And when Vertin lets us know that the line in her hand that's connected to the shimmering wheel forms a path for her, an arcanist appears at the lake, supposedly invited over. And to top it all off, anyone who isn't Vertin ends up blacking out at that lake. So what could that mean, and how does this answer any of the questions I asked before? Well, let's talk about what it could mean first. We can suspect that the old spinning wheel has connections to the three fates in Greek mythology. You might be more familiar with them being called the Moirai, or the three sisters, Clotha, Lehisis, and Atropos. In case you're not familiar with them, the three fates weave the thread of each person's destiny. Clotha spins the thread, Lehisis measures it, and Atropos cuts it. The present, future, and past. Basically, they determine the lives of others with the thread of life. And if you remember, we use something called clear drops and crystal drops to get Unilogs, which we then use to roll new characters at the spinning wheel. In the description of the clear drop, it says that it's the quiet twin, the most reliable of the siblings, and the one always giving help to those in need. It's armed with every virtue, and it's the last raindrop to rise, and the first to return to Earth. Going back to the biblical references, I suspect that the clear drops represent the angels of creation. But what are these angels? Taking a step back, I should probably explain the 9 choirs of angels first. So, within the 9 choirs of angels, we have 3 hierarchies which then contain 3 orders. At the highest hierarchy in the choirs of angels, we have the following 3 orders: seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. In the middle, we have the creation of angels, or the following 3 orders: domination, virtues, and powers. And then at the lowest, we have principalities, archangels, and guardian angels. As I said before, I believe the clear drops represent the angels of creation. They are the most reliable of the 3 hierarchies when it comes to maintaining order in the universe. So that fits the most reliable of the siblings part. They're also the quiet twin, with the twin referring to the top 2 hierarchies. And the quiet connecting to the fact that they don't directly interfere with matters, unlike the highest hierarchy. Being armed with every virtue highlights the angels of virtues. Their duties of maintaining order in the universe are why they are the last to rise to the heavens between the top 2 hierarchies, but the first to return to the earth. Fun fact, they're also sometimes referred to as the Shining Ones. Take that as you may. And then we have crystal drops. You might not be familiar with this if you're a free-to-play player like myself, but this particular drop has a different description. It says that the storm arrived and the raindrops rose into the skies as though returning to their mother's embrace, and the blistering hot cauldron from which they came. But accidents might just happen. If they fail to reach the other side before the storm ends, they'll fall back to the earth. Very ominous at the end there. After reading that though, I could only suspect one thing, that the crystal drops represent the highest choirs of angels who dwell closest to the throne of God. So seraphim, cherubim, and the thrones. You know, in some sources, they actually said that the angels honor Mary, Jesus' mother, as their queen. If that's the case here, then it checks out that they're returning to their mother's embrace, since the mother, would be Mary, or a figure that's like Mary in the game. Not to mention, seraphim in particular was sometimes referred to as burning fires of love. So, the blistering hot cauldron fits with that too. And of course, we can't forget about the fallen angels, or Lucifer, who used to be a part of the highest choirs of angels. So if they fail to reach the other side, aka the equivalent to the throne of God, before the storm ends, then they'll fall back to the earth like how the fallen angels did. And lastly, we have the Unilog that we use to actually spin the wheel and roll a character. In its description, it says that it's a unique thread that was never spun and can spin the spinning wheel one time. It also notes that the golden rabbit is a well-known myth. It spies on people, steals their time, and sometimes even changes their fates. Though it's old, decrepit, and stale, it's unique and indispensable. Now, from the top of my head, I thought of the rabbit in the moon myth, and maybe you did too. But rabbits aren't really connected to anything major in the Bible, nor are they connected to the angels themselves. So I decided to turn my research towards Greek mythology, in particular, more about the Moirai. And then it hit me. Moirai are sometimes known as the three moon sisters, representing the different moon phases. But when we think about the moon and Greek mythology, we can't help but remember the moon goddess Artemis. Not to mention, she's the goddess of the hunt, nature, and wild animals, which a rabbit can be. And considering that this game was made in China, it's not surprising if they chose the rabbit as the representative of Artemis and her role as the goddess of wild animals because of the rabbit in the moon myth. I also suspect that they chose the color gold because it's been long depicted as a royal or divine color in many mythologies and in history, aside from the color purple. But it could also be referring to her close familial relationship with her twin brother Apollo, who is the god of the sun and light, with the gold representing the sun. I'm leaning towards the latter. So, the golden rabbit representing Artemis might feel like a stretch at first, even with those connections, until we learn that in some cases, Artemis is closely tied with the Moirai because she was a symbol of health, a midwife to babies, and presided over the passage of humans from one life stage to another. And she caused a lot of deaths herself, and we can't forget that many Greek goddesses and gods are known to be as horrible and as great as humans. So, spying on people, stealing their time by causing death, and sometimes even changing their fates, not really out of the question for them, including Artemis. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why does she keep talking about this? And what does all of that have to do with the storm and Vertin? I'll answer that soon enough, but let's first push through the last few things, so buckle up. Do you remember how even if someone goes into Vertin's suitcase, if they are susceptible to the storm syndrome, then they'll still disappear after the storm hits? You do? Good. Then let's also remember that those who are immune to the storm syndrome are a different story. They tend to be the ones who can survive the storm by being in Vertin's suitcase. But what is this storm syndrome again? As a refresher, the storm syndrome are the pernicious habits of the era and society that are then transformed into mutations that affect people. Anyone affected by this syndrome will be essentially cleansed and removed when the storm hits. That's something Forget-Me-Not talks about heavily at the end of chapter 1. So if the storm represents the Genesis flood, then I highly suspect that the storm syndrome is the manifestation of that era and society's sin. And that is what the storm is cleansing. But that's not all. We know that the ones who can see the mutations of the world are immune to the storm syndrome. This means that they're also eligible to be saved by boarding the ark, like going into Vertin's suitcase. But going by what I said earlier about the storm syndrome being the manifestation of sin, this means that the ones who can see the mutations, or the chosen ones, can see the sins of the world. And yet, they can't survive the storm without Vertin's suitcase or even without the Foundation or Manus Vindictae, because in reality, the storm syndrome is only a part of the criteria for someone to be considered a chosen one. And speaking of the words chosen one, I find it very ironic that the younger arcanists at SPDM are called that by the adults, even though they probably don't actually think of them as true or chosen ones and are just calling them that for impure reasons that I won't get into right now. Anyways, what does it actually mean to be a chosen one? Does it only mean that they have the potential to survive the storm and that's it? Or is there more to being a so-called chosen one? Recalling what I talked about earlier, the chosen ones are those who can be saved from the flood by boarding the ark, meaning that they're the ones who are saved by Vertin's suitcase from the storm and can be summoned by Vertin. And so this leads us to a very specific thing. What is it? I'll give you a short hint. When you think of Jesus and the number 12, what do you think of? Waiting. That's right, the disciples. I suspect that the people we summon with the spinning wheel greatly resemble Jesus's many disciples, or in our case, they would be our many disciples. Not the core 12 that we're used to, but all of them. That being said, out of the many disciples Jesus had, we can't forget about that core 12, the ones who are considered to be the closest to Jesus and are the most famous. So you might be thinking to yourself now, okay, I get that the chosen ones are the disciples, but do we know who the 12 in the story are? No and yes. No, we don't know who all of the canonical 12 disciples are in the actual story as of version 1.2, but we do know who the 12 disciples that you, the player, chose are. Or at least some of them. Probably. Maybe. How can that be? Well, let's remember that as players, we use two of the same materials to level up our characters, Dust and Sharpodonti. Here the description for Dust says that they are the echoes of the Ultra Law. The glorious Supreme Law is nowhere to be found, but its power is great and beyond prediction. As it wanders, its dropping dust also contains the energy for power increasing. It is, in a sense, part of the ultimate answer. Okay, so let's assume that the Ultra Law is the teachings of God, or a representation of it. Then the echoes make sense because the disciples repeat after and follow the teachings of God. The glorious Supreme Law would then be God's actual wisdom, which is what makes its power great and beyond prediction, because it's the divine knowledge that us humans wouldn't have. But as his wisdom is being spread by the disciples, the religious faith for those disciples increase. This parallels with what is written about how the dropping dust can increase the power energy. And then we have the description for Sharpodonti that says that it's an acceptable currency amongst the arcanists, that everyone needs some of this, that it's a currency from the ancient unrecorded era. It has 13 edges and a maw of razor-sharp teeth, which only opens to those with arcanist blood. Okay, I get that it doesn't sound very religious or anything along those lines, but from a biblical perspective, the number 13 tends to signal the start of something new, whether it was someone's age, the number of years, the day of the month, the specific year, or whatever. You get it. But I know, I would honestly be skeptical too if that was the only thing I was going to talk about. So, I'll specifically focus on the whole a maw of razor-sharp teeth, which only opens to those with arcanist blood instead. Now, when you think of teeth, you may think of the gnashing of teeth phrase. And thankfully, the phrase wailing and gnashing of teeth appears multiple times in the Bible's New Testament. Some sources mention that this even represents the sorrow, remorse, and regret that unfaithful believers experience at the judgment seat of God. So, if the Sharpodonti closes its mouth for non-arcanists, just like how the gnashing of teeth was used for non-believers in the Bible, then clearly it would open its mouth to believers, or in this case, the arcanists. You know, in a lot of ways, it's as if the Sharpodonti is confirming who is actually an arcanist and who isn't. Kind of like a lie detector. And of course, we can't forget about the triangle symbols, those suspicious looking triangles that are everywhere in most areas of the character profile page. I mean, come on. It's in the leveling up, the insight, the refrain, the portray, and the resonate. I've thought a lot about the significance it can have. And then I came across something interesting. What is it? The gospel triangle. Now, what is this gospel triangle? Well, in the Bible, most of Jesus' miracles were performed in 3 specific towns: These 3 towns were then called the Gospel Triangle because they formed a triangle with the points being 3 miles apart. So I feel like it could be paying a homage to that. I do want to remind us as well that there is such a thing as a bond in this game, which I know many experienced players already know of and probably maxed out. I still haven't, but you guys are amazing. So we'll be going with the assumption that 100% bond means that we've reached the max closeness level possible with the character. And of course, knowing that you guys are probably experienced more than me, but if you're not, then hooray, I'm not alone. We only have a limited amount of resources to build a character fully. So, going back to our question of the 12 disciples, this means that the more dust and sharper Dante a character gets, and the more we increase our bond with that character, then the more that character raises their power energy, and the closer they are to become a part of the 12. Our 12. In other words, any character that the player builds up to Insight 3 and has 100% bond with is going to be a part of their 12 disciples. As for who the actual canonical 12 disciples are, that will have to be discussed in another video, unfortunately, due to lack of time. Okay, cool. So now it's time to answer all of the questions and tie everything together. Remember how I mentioned that Vertin's suitcase represents Noah's Ark and the storm represents the Genesis flood that wiped out everything on Earth except for everything on the Ark? Well, there has been much speculation that Noah's Ark is actually a symbol of Jesus, since it is said in the Bible that Jesus is the only hope for those who reject God when it comes to escaping God's future judgment. Assuming that the writers used this aspect in the story, we might also want to recall that the purpose of the Genesis flood was to purify the world. So assuming that the storm actually represents the Genesis flood, then the storm is also a form of God's future judgment in the context of the story. And if the storm syndrome is the manifestation of the era and society's sin, then that is what the storm is actually cleansing. And since Vertin's suitcase is the ark, then Vertin must be Noah, so together they form the symbol of Jesus or of a Messiah. Hard to believe? Then let's keep going. In the suitcase, the ground was covered by rainwater from the storm. They didn't clarify if that rainwater is part of the lake, but let's assume that to be the case here. This means that the lake contains God's judgment or the storm. And then there's that mysterious fog that surrounds the lake. Here, we'll assume that the fog depicts God's presence. After all, there's no clear explanations of what God looks like in the Bible due to him being divine, so the fog representing what others see when they try to view God when they are in his presence isn't really that far-fetched. At least, for now. And because Jesus is the Son of God and is the personification of God's will, depending on the version of the Bible we use, he is someone who is granted a special privilege and has a close understanding of God and his will. Knowing this, if Vertin represents the symbol of Jesus, then she too must have the same special privilege and close understanding of the higher being and their will, even if she might not really consciously realize it right now. So, going with the assumption that the fog represents the higher being's presence and the lake representing the higher being's judgment, this must be why Vertin doesn't faint at the lake, because she's technically allowed to directly be in the presence of the higher being due to being the personification of that higher being's will. Whew, that was long. Anyways, because she is that personification, that could also be the reason why she's allowed to activate the spinning wheel to summon those who are immune to the storm syndrome, or as we called it, the chosen ones. How can I be so sure of that? Well, let's recall that the chosen ones are technically disciples who strongly resemble Jesus' own disciples. And I'm not talking about the 12 right now. So, when we look at the process of summoning those disciples, we see that the Messiah calls upon the choirs of angels to summon Artemis, and then sends Artemis to convince the Moirai to summon the chosen ones, which ultimately changes their initial fate to perish. Okay, so we understood that one from one point of view. Then let's talk about the same process again, but from a different point of view. Here, the moment the Messiah sends Artemis to the Moirai, the higher being sends their judgment to Artemis so that when she interferes with the Moirai's work, they end up summoning the chosen ones who have been selected by the higher being through their judgment. At this point, maybe you can tell what I'm trying to show here, or maybe not, that's okay. But this whole summoning process from both points of view shows that the Messiah and the higher being both have the same will and intention, which I feel is further speculative evidence that Vertin is the true personification of the higher being's will, just like how Jesus is with God. But more than anything, the biggest piece of evidence that Vertin is the Messiah is the player's own 12 disciples. Similar to how becoming a part of Jesus' inner circle requires a close bond and high religious faith, the player is more likely to add a character to their team for battles when they have a 100% bond and a high power energy level. Not to mention, powering up these characters to their maximum potential can only be done with the player's decisions and actions, just like how most of the miracles performed in the Gospel Triangle area were done by Jesus himself. And speaking of triangles, if we look at the triangle symbols that are everywhere on the character profile page, they're what's used to show the progression and development of these characters' power energy level, which adds to the fact that powering up these characters to their maximum potential can be considered a miracle performed by the player. But why does that matter? If you recall, the main character that we play is Vertin. So all of our actions and decisions that we make in this game are technically Vertin's actions and decisions as well. Although they may sometimes be non-canonical to the story. And I'm sure you guys already knew that this was going to be the case. So this means that our non-canonical 12 are technically Vertin's non-canonical 12 as well, which fits the whole picture that Vertin represents the symbol of Jesus, since Jesus has his own 12 disciples. Honestly, you probably already put that together during the earlier section, but I still have to say it. So the references in the descriptions for Dust and Sharperdonti further prove this, especially since they have the same functionality and purpose as the teachings of God and the confirmations of being a disciple. Putting it into a more biblical or religious perspective, what I mean, the disciples' religious faith only increases when they embrace the teachings of God and are confirmed to be Jesus' disciples, which are both most likely taught and confirmed by Jesus himself. And obviously, seeing miracles performed by Jesus with their own eyes in the Gospel Triangle area further locks onto or even ascends their level of religious faith. So in a sense, Dust and Sharperdonti have a relationship with the power energy level system that's very similar to the resources and system used to increase a disciple's religious faith, if we look at everything in a very systematic manner. Anyway, since Jesus was most likely the one to provide most of the resources to his disciples to increase their religious faith through such a system, it checks out that the player who plays as Vertin can do the same, but obviously to increase a character's power energy level instead, since Vertin represents the symbol of Jesus. And with that, we've discussed some of the more interesting tidbits that prove that Vertin is not just a Noah and that she is, in fact, the true Messiah of the story like Jesus. Now, the last thing we might be curious about at this point is how important her role as the Messiah is in the story. I don't really have a clear answer yet for that, since there's only 4 chapters out, but judging how much she influenced the people around her so far, I do suspect that it'll take a while before her role as the Messiah truly is at the forefront of the plot or conflict. And when I say that her role is at the forefront, I mean that it's going to take her a long while before she recognizes her actual role as the Messiah in the story. But I do believe that she could have an inkling of it at the end of chapter 4, but at the same time, I don't think she truly embraced her role consciously as of now. But I do suspect that in a future chapter, she'll most likely go through a baptism-like experience, and then when she does, that'll be the moment when the truth of the storm will be revealed to her, when she herself will understand the true value of her being and of her role as the Messiah, just like how Jesus became the true Son of God during his baptism. And then at that point, I think she'll probably take a more active approach to bring about salvation to the world as a representative of the higher being's will. This higher being could most likely be the origination of the storm, or even be the one who is influencing it in actuality, although I'm leaning towards the former. I don't know about you. Either way, I don't really know yet since I don't have enough evidence about this last part as of today, so please take it with a grain of salt. In any case, this was actually when and where I originally planned to talk about Schneider, Manus Vindictae, the Foundation, and the other Arcanist characters, and how they support or shape Vertin's Messiah role, but that'll make this video a bit too long, so those will probably be its own videos, maybe a long ramble or just a structured video. I'm not really sure yet, but either way, keep an eye out for them later as I wrap things up here. But before I go, I want to give a quick shout out to all of my server sub members and to you who finished watching this video. Seriously, if you watched the end, then thank you very much. And if I could, I would even cook you a nice meal as thanks, but since I can't, do that, this is all I can do. But yeah, I'll get going now. See you later.